A few months ago, we released a video that introduced working with groundwater levels. This video will expand on that by looking at groundwater levels and some of the analysis tools that are available for looking at groundwater level data. So I've already opened up, I logged on to the partners website, and I've already opened up a window that takes me into the mapping portal for oakridgeswater.ca here through GeoCortex. And what I'm looking at here, if I zoom in, the purple dots here represent groundwater wells that have more than 35 water level measurements in them over time. And there's one in particular that I want to look at, just southeast of Lake Simcoe. The town of Cannington has some wells that show some interesting some data here. So I'm going to click on this particular location here. The pop-up window shows me that there's two wells here. There's Cannington OW99 2S, S for shallow. If I pull this drop down open, there's also 2D for deep. So there's a nested pair here. Also in this pop-up, there's an opportunity to get into the water levels a little more, a little deeper. So I'm going to click on the time series. That opens up into Shiny Apps, which is our analysis, one of our analysis platforms. This is loading all the data for those two, the shallow and deep observation wells. And this is similar to what we saw earlier when we looked at just introducing the concept of looking at groundwater level data. So we can see here up top, we've got Cannington OW99 2D and 2S. We've got a number of graphs here shown: atmospheric pressure, precipitation, which includes the breakdown between rainfall and snowfall or snow melt. We're also looking at temperature. Now this is temperature within the transducer it's measuring groundwater temperature, and then the water levels shown below. So the first thing I'm going to do is clean this up a bit. I'm going to turn off some of the I'm going to turn off air pressure, and I'm going to turn off temperature. So just looking at some of these data, we can see on the bottom we're looking at water levels in green for the deep monitoring location, and in orange for the shallow. The shallow is spikier and the water levels are higher. We can also see point data, which represents the manual static water level measurements, and we can see transducer data shown as the lines. You can see there's quite a bit of manual data early on in time. In the early 2000s, the transducer started in about, looks like 2004. There's a big gap in the manual data. Then there's data from both sources right up until 2020, when we're looking at just transducer data. We can also compare some of these spikes in water levels to precipitation events. So that's just quickly a summary of just looking at some of this information. But really what I want to stress in this video is up here at the very top, right next to the S hydrograph option, there's a drop down for trends, and I'm going to click on annual summary. Again, all these different parameters show up, but I just want to look at a couple of things quickly. So I'm going to turn off some of the different information. I'm just going to look at the logger or the transducer data. And so up on top, we're looking at annual average water levels for the shallow location in blue and the deep location in red. You can see they follow a similar trend with a slight downward gradient, with higher water level in the shallow, at the shallow elevation. You can also see that around 2013 to 2014, there's a pretty big drop in water levels, and the water levels stay lower. So you can see this trend where there's a sort of a plateau up here around 257 meters above sea level, and it's dropped down to 256.5. So it's about a half a meter drop where things have stayed since about 2014 in both the shallow and the deep, based on annual averages. The bottom graph shows a similar trend. We're looking at, in the bar graph, we're looking at differences annually relative to the mean water level. So up till again 2013, 2014, water levels were typically above the mean, and since then they've been below the mean in both the shallow and deep. But that's not showing the whole picture. The other thing we can look at is the seasonal summary. So these four graphs are showing, we're just going to look at the deep one here for now, the deep elevation. The four graphs represent four different seasons. The first graph is December, January, February, so it's the winter months. You can see there's a plateau of fairly high water levels in the deep, at the deep elevation, followed by a drop off. In spring, March, April, May, similar trend. In the summer, June, July, August, similar trend. So throughout the year, through all four seasons, in the deep piezometer, we're seeing a similar decrease in water levels in about 2014. Now let's look at the shallow location, and we'll look at the transducer data as well. December, January, February, we see a similar trend with that drop. March, April, May in the spring, a similar but somewhat subdued drop. In the summer, June, July, August, we see a similar drop. And we do it again in September, October, November, or the fall, although those start out lower as well. So we can really start to look at seasonal trends, annual trends, and so on with these analysis tools. The next thing I want to do is look at some of the statistics. And under density distribution, first we're going to let's look at the shallow first. The shallow manual water levels. Now this is showing the distribution of water levels versus the normal curve. So here, when we're looking at manual water levels, you can see it doesn't quite follow the normal curve, but it's pretty close, with a mean of around 257 meters above sea level. If we look at the transducer or logger information, we can see there's a bimodal distribution here. So what this is telling us is that, first of all, the manual water levels don't always show the whole picture. When we look at transducer or logger information, where water levels are taken every 15 minutes or every hour, or even every day, we can see a better picture of the distribution of water levels over time at a particular location. We'll just flip on to the deep, and we see the same. Somewhat normal for the manual water levels, but for the logger, again, we see a bimodal distribution, again stressing the importance of looking at transducers for really capturing what's happening at these locations. We can also look at the annual extremes. So it'll just take a few seconds for this to come up. Now what this is showing is there's a lot of information here. I'll just summarize a couple of things. But first, this top graph in the upper left, we're looking at 2D, so the deep well. This is showing the return period. Now that's just terminology from hydrology and stream flow measurements and looking at maximum floods. So if we think about, for groundwater, the return period being the occurrence of water level values. So roughly every 20 years, we have seen a water level as high as almost 260. So that's a loose way of estimating what the extreme water levels could be at that particular location. The graph in the upper right is showing the anomalies of annual water levels relative to a mean. So here's the zero line. If a year plots above that zero line, then that year the water levels were higher than the mean. If it's below, then the water levels were below the mean. So what this allows us to see is, okay, the earlier years, shown in purple and green, purple and blue, tend to plot above the mean, whereas the later years, shown in yellow and green, tend to plot below the mean. So there's appears to be this trend of decreasing water levels at this deep location. There's also a quick summary of the Mann-Kendall value here, minus 0.6, which indicates that in fact there is a decrease in the water levels over time at this location. We can also look at that's just the manual data for 2D, the deep well. We can also look at the logger information, and we see similar trends. We see a 20-year value that's quite a bit lower to begin with, but we also see a similar trend with a man candle of about minus 0.6. Most of the earlier years are above the mean. Most of the more recent years are below the mean. So what this allows us to do is really understand what's happening over time at this location. This location and these two elevations. If we go back to the map, we can see this location that we've chosen. Now, we don't have time right now to look into what the trends are in some of these other locations, but it would be really interesting to see if the data shows a similar decreasing trend around 2013, 2014. And if it does, what might be causing that? Is it climate? Is it some other stress? Is there another water taking, a permit to take water, or a municipal well that was turned on in that area that has resulted in a reduction of the water table? The one last thing that I want to show here now is the cumulative distribution function. So what this is showing is the CDF, cumulative distribution function, for the different parameters again. But let's just look at the water levels. You can see here the blue line is the CDF for the logger information. The blue points above it are the manual or static measurements, and the same in red for the deeper location. What's interesting here is if we look at the halfway mark, or the 0.5 or 50% for the shallow, this shows that at a water level of about 256.5-ish, above that value are half the measurements, and below that are half the measurements. But at the higher end, you can see as we go up, there's a long tail here with water levels that go quite a bit higher. That could mean that this shallower well, or the shallower location, is more affected by rainfall and snowmelt events. And we don't see that in the deeper well because of, obviously, it's buffered somewhat. Thanks for your interest in this video and in the Oak Ridges Moraine Groundwater Program, and please pay attention to some of the other videos that we'll be releasing on our YouTube webpage. Thanks.